All right. Hello and welcome, everyone. We are so excited to have you here for our first ever Trust Radius LinkedIn Live event. Today, we're discussing our latest research, what's in and what's out, a go-to-market playbook for 2023. This playbook is intended to help B2B business leaders like you respond to significant shifts in B2B tech buying behavior. And there's no better way to digest this data than to bring in the experts. So, with us today, I'm excited to introduce industry thought leader Megan Headley, Managing VP of Research at Trust Radius, who led the research efforts for this playbook. Megan, do you want to introduce yourself really quickly?
Sure, really quickly. Hello, everyone. My name is Megan. We've been doing this research for 6 years, so I'm really excited to share some of the findings for you.
Thank you. And we're also joined today by Allison Havener. She's our VP of Marketing at Trust Radius that worked on synthesizing the research in this report to make it actionable for you all. Allison, do you want to say hi?
Hi, everyone. Excited to be here today and discuss more about this report.
Fabulous. And then last but certainly not least, we have Simon Jones, managing partner at Destrier, a consultancy that works with vendors around the globe to implement and optimize enterprise peer review programs. So he is definitely our expert to making it happen in the market. So let's get it started here. First question over to you, Megan. Can you walk me through the research you did for both buyers and sellers and why this research is so important for the B2B tech industry?
Absolutely. So like I said, this is annual research that we've been doing at Trust Radius for the past 6 years. And it's based on a survey of more than 2,000 technology buyers as well as marketers at technology companies. And we're looking at things like, the behaviors of business technology buyers. What kinds of information sources are they using? How are they using those sources? How are they making those decisions? And how are they looking to connect with vendors? And we really like to just highlight any gaps between what buyers are looking for versus what sellers are providing. And so I would say this research is important for any technology company that wants to better understand their buyers or serve the needs of their buyers better and, ultimately impact the bottom line.
Great. It sounds like it's really insightful data. What do you think are some of the most compelling data points within the research?
So one thing that came out really clearly this year was the demand for pricing transparency by buyers. So this really came through in a lot of the different areas of the research. It's the number one piece of information that buyers want to be able to self-serve. They don't want your salespeople to be the gatekeepers to that information. Pricing transparency tops the list of what makes buyers more likely to buy from a vendor or a particular company. And the lack of pricing information tops the list of what makes buyers less likely to buy. When they don't have easy access to pricing, a majority of buyers either totally stop considering your product or slow down their process and keep researching. Another really, kind of interesting area of findings this year was just the amount of research that buyers are doing to avoid having to take you at your word. So we've been looking at the usage of things like reviews and peers and all of that for a number of years now. And, those kinds of things have been at the top of the list in terms of information sources that buyers consult. But this year, even communities and forums came out in the top 5 most commonly used resources for buyers, displacing your own website as an information source. So buyers are going anywhere they can to find raw, unfiltered perspectives on products.
Yeah, so it sounds like they don't want to hear it from the horse's mouth. They don't want, they might reference a vendor website, but they really want that third party validation and to do their own exploration. And that kind of brings me to my next question for you. What do you feel are some of the largest disconnects between the way buyers are self-serving and the way that our sellers are going to market today?
Yeah, so that desire for self-service versus what vendors are really providing is one of the biggest areas of disconnect this year. So virtually 100% of the buyers we survey are looking to self-serve at least part of the buying journey. But in our survey of tech marketers, only 12% correctly guessed that, nearly 100% of buyers have some amount of demand for self-service. And some of the biggest areas where buyers want transparency and self-service are the areas that vendors really aren't providing it. So 81% of buyers want to be able to find pricing on their own. They don't want to have to talk to you first. And only a third of technology companies are providing that pricing transparency. Same story with something like a self-guided demo. 69% of buyers want it, and only 40% of technology companies are offering it.
Wow, that's amazing. And that 12% stat of marketers that guess that buyers want to self-serve is really impressive. So that really mirrors that there is a true shift happening in the marketplace. And Allison, I'd love to hear from you, kind of based on this data. What are some of the recommendations that you would give to sellers in accordance with this shift?
Well, I think what you're seeing in the data is that buyers just want you to connect with them on their terms, right? They're really sitting kind of in the power seat right now. And to Megan's point, they don't want all of that information to be behind a salesperson. They don't want to have to request that demo, book that meeting with the salesperson until they're actually ready to make a purchase. So it's super important to think about your sphere of influence with your buyers and making sure, one, what information do I actually have readily available right now? How are they going to find it? Where are they doing their research? So you can start to do some of that analysis on your current properties that you have right now, right? Because we still know that they're going to your website, but then they're going to go somewhere else and validate that. They're going to be talking to their peers. They're going to be reading reviews, which is where Simon and the work that he does is really important. Because again, they want to hear and find that real world experience as much as possible. And so the more you can give them that exposure, the more likely you're going to get on that short list. And then they're going to talk to your sales team. Then they're going to engage with you. So you really want to think about how you're connecting with them on their terms. And I think the other thing that you're seeing is it's just the way it works in the consumer world, right? And so you think about yourself as a consumer. You want as much product information as you can up front. You're validating that through customers that have already used the product, and then you want that to be an easy transaction. And so it's really important that these are the way that millennials and Gen Z are actually buying in the consumer world, and now they're translating that to the technology world.
Thanks so much, Allison. And I'm curious, so we talked about, what we can do. Do you have any tips of what marketers should not do considering these trends?
Well, I think, if you think about what Megan was saying around buyers wanting to find this information and safeguarding it behind your sales team, right? That's number one. But I think the second thing is if you really want to connect with buyers in an authentic way and on their terms, like the cold calling, the cold emails, like that is like a huge deterrent. And I think that people don't necessarily think that, right? If you think about your SDR team or if you think about your sales team and they're doing this outreach, how can you connect with buyers again on their terms? Because if you're just relying on cold outreach, cold calls, that just sounds like a really all the marketers that are watching, how many emails do you dodge? How many phone calls do you dodge all day, right? And so I think that not only does that hurt from your bottom line perspective, but that can also hurt your brand. So I think one thing that you should really think about and take seriously is the way how buyers want to engage with you, because that's going to help you in the long run from a pipeline perspective and from a brand perspective.
Yeah, I agree completely. Actually, someone on our team earlier today described sales reps as pesky mosquitoes, those BDR emails coming through. So while these serve a purpose, of course, there's other things that you can do to put yourself front and center where buyers are going, especially for third-party validation. And that brings me to Simon. So Simon's really our expert in helping vendors and sellers in the market really get their peer review programs off the ground. Simon, do you want to tell us a little bit more about how reviews aren't just a numbers game? They kind of are, but they're kind of not. Tell us a little bit about that. And in your view, how are buyers using review platforms and to what extent are they influencing purchase decisions?
I'm happy to do that. And first of all, I'd like to add to what Alison said in terms of a tip on what not to do. And that's just to go and ignore review sites like TrustRadius. And we still come across vendors that are in denial. Oh, it's going to be a passing fad. It's going away. No one reads that sort of thing anyway. And we're constantly surfacing data which shows that it is. And so if you haven't downloaded the B2B Buy Disconnect, it's a great report. I recommend reading through it. Now, the only realistic way that a review site like TrustRadius has got of showing which vendors are doing well, there's two ways. First of all, it's by stack ranking, and that's the number of reviews and the score. Because otherwise, every vendor that got one top-rated review, 10 stars in your case, would be top of the tree. So you've got to then score them in a 2x2 matrix. Otherwise, it would be chaos. And so we recommend that any vendor that's serious about this needs to get out there and play the game in this category. If your competitors are on TrustRadius, you need to be there too. Because otherwise, as I think it was Vinay from TrustRadius who said, the conversation is going to happen with or without you present. So you need to make sure that you're in the game. And there's a lot of stack ranking going on in the market, and this is really given the advantage to smaller vendors. We see constantly examples of small vendors with tiny, tiny market shares that are really significantly punching above their weight. And it's quite amazing, really, that they're up against some really big global tech vendors that are really yet to properly engage. And we often hear signs of denial from these big companies in the market. And they refuse to acknowledge that many buyers, the Gen Zs, the millennials, are using review sites to create vendor shortlists even before they've appeared on your radar. So if your hook's not in the water, you're not fishing, first of all, with the reviews. And of course, we don't think that anyone in their right mind is going to be basing a $100,000 plus buying decision on the strength of a few reviews they read online, right? I think we still think they're going to go and do some interrogation of the vendors to make the final decision. But the shortlist is where you could miss out. And this is big number deals. And you could be excluded simply because you're not on the review sites or you don't have enough performance. So that's one key thing. And finally, if you're talking about influencers, then the industry analysts, they're also reading the reviews. And they're acting on them. So I know you have a partnership with Omdia where you provide insight of the voice of the customer into their analyst reports. And so anyone who's still not paying any attention to this really needs to get on with it.
I agree. And I just want to drop a line to our viewers out there watching. We have this panel of experts. You're probably thinking, sitting there listening to Simon and saying, oh, well, is my review program up to snuff? Am I appearing where I'm supposed to be to target buyers? If you have questions, put them in the chat and we'll surface them and we'll get everybody talking about them. So that was really insightful, Simon. Thank you so much. Megan, I'm curious to hear your perspective on what Simon just conveyed here. Kind of looking at the data in our trends report, how do we see review trends over time?
So one thing I think was really interesting that you said, Simon, was kind of calling out the 2x2 as a really important place to be when it comes to review sites or analyst firms. I would love to hear from you kind of what's your understanding of how buyers kind of leverage those 2x2s? To what extent are they influential? Where do they go from there once looking at a 2x2?
I'll give you a really quick answer to that. We work a lot with high-end enterprise players. And so when an enterprise vendor is in an RFP, the RFP will often say, can you please provide some evidence, like an analyst report, that you're a leader? Okay. And in some cases, they may not be a quadrant or a wave anymore that's still focusing on that market. So you provide one from 3 or 4 years ago. What we've seen vendors doing is using either the grid from TrustRadius, the Trust Index, something from another review site, God forbid. But they've been showing this, surfacing this evidence because you've got proof. And there's nothing more compelling than a report that goes onto a boardroom table that shows the dot of the vendor you're about to buy from as being a leader. And it may be that this report gets a couple of seconds of attention from an investment committee, but that's enough. And so really, you need some kind of proof, and visual proof, dots, leadership, top right is always very, very compelling.
Yeah, that's super interesting. One of the things that we see in terms of how buyers are engaging on our site at Trust Radius is, there's a role that the 2x2 plays. There's a role that the ranking plays and the score and the number of reviews and all of that. But we really see buyers going a lot deeper than that. In terms of, the 2x2 might give you some sort of visual sense of a market, but that really doesn't answer the question of like, here's my use case, my scenario, which product is going to best serve my needs. And so what we see a lot on our site and in the B2B disconnect kind of research is buyers really using reviews as a way to find those other peers, find those other users who are similar to their scenario, company size, industry, use case, years of experience, et cetera, and using that to really kind of zero in on some of the core questions that they have that, previously they maybe had to actually just talk to the vendor to get information on.
And they're still going to also go to an analyst and then say, look, I've got this short list of 3. And I've talked to plenty of analysts about this who said they used to have calls all the time saying, tell me about the market. Tell me which vendors are to be looked at. But now they're getting buyers who come to them and say, right, I've got my short list. Help me to decide. Okay, so the market has really changed. And some vendors have still not yet caught up with that. So,
well,
right.
and
I think that's the important piece is giving buyers that information so you can make their short list. And so if buyers are already going to analysts or they're going to the buying committee, right? They're coming and they're having that short list, they're doing their research, and they've never even engaged with you. And I think that's really the piece that is changing from your go to market as a technology vendor, is that there's this sense of like, hey, they get into my database, I nurture them, sales reaches out, and it feels like this linear process. But the buying and the decisioning process is completely not linear, and it's anonymous. And so it's really, really challenging now, for marketers and sales teams to kind of capture those buyers where they are and make that short list. So I think that goes back to, Grace, your question about what people should be doing. It's like, that's why it's so important to have all this information up front, have that social proof up front, have those customer testimonials, those reviews, etc., because all of that's going to happen with or without you.
and of course, there's one more thing, which is that there's this thing called buyer's remorse, and it happens just as much in the B2B space as it does in the consumer space. And so you've just made the decision, and you're waiting for the deployment, or you're waiting for the deployment to go through. And so you're going to read reviews afterwards. And so it's always reassuring that you're not the first. You're not the first widget maker in South America, in the transportation sector, to have done this. And that's very reassuring for people.
that's very true.
Go ahead, Megan.
Yeah, I was just going to get back to kind of your original question, Grace, around just what are some of the trends here. And I'll keep it brief, but I think one important thing to keep in mind with this year's report is a lot of this stuff, the rise of independent research, the usage of things like peer reviews, buyers' desire to stay anonymous, these are all trends that have been developing for years, for a long time. I think the interesting thing about this past year is that we saw that really accelerate, like any gap that remained in those trends got closed last year, and you could think about, is it, how work really changed during the pandemic. There's different maybe factors that led to closing that gap, but the gap is now closed. No one can, to your point, Simon, you still hear this from vendors. No one can hear this research and say, oh, not my buyers. Those are different buyers. Those aren't my buyers. You can't say that anymore. It's all buyers are exhibiting these kind of behaviors in some way or another.
And that's fantastically true, because whenever I take data that comes out of the reviews and stuff, and I go back to product marketing or product management, and I share with them the feedback, I often get wild-eyed looks back, like, where did you get this from? And I say, well, it's online. It's in the review sites. And that does tend to be an aha moment for people.
Yeah, and you're also seeing that trend, from buyers are so hungry for this content. So we introduced pricing pages on Trust Radius, and we saw a huge amount of traffic going to those pages. I think it was over a 280% increase. But then what we also saw is that when we had it coupled with the CTA, so referral traffic to that vendor also increased by almost 150%. So it's like, great, they're looking for this information. They had that information, and then they click through to learn more about that particular vendor. So you're seeing that journey just from like a introduction of a pricing page. So I think that to your point, Megan, that the gap is completely closed between those trends. But then we're also just seeing buyers completely take those actions just on Trust Radius.
Yep. And we actually have a relevant question to this topic in the chat from Kevin Gray, who's a product marketing leader. He asked, are there any specific trends on product-led growth, companies? And we're a product-led growth company, and tying it back to platform investment and using those insights, I'll pass it over to Megan to tell a little bit more.
Yeah, well, one thing I want to call out in the B2B Disconnect research this year is another kind of big change that we saw was the rise in the usage of free trials. And so, that was another information source that previously had been kind of consistent on the list, and last year we saw a big jump. And I think that ties directly into the rise in kind of the business methodology of relying on product-led growth and the value that a lot of technology companies are seeing there. Offering that sort of free trial really allows you to give the buyer what they want, which is some hands-on experience with the product in order to make that decision. And I think those trends really, really tie together.
Yep, absolutely. So we've identified that there's a demand in the market for this. Buyers are demanding it. Vendors are starting to catch up. What are some specific things that marketers can do, Allison, in their full funnel approach to marketing, leveraging this information?
So one thing that we haven't addressed that I think is super important, and Simon, you kind of alluded to this a little bit, is around market differentiation. So you mentioned that there's kind of like these disruptors in maybe a particular industry that are kind of punching above their weight class. And I think that when you think about kind of like that full funnel is telling your story and really differentiating in the market. And the way you do that is through customer voice. So if you think about your competition can make the same product. Your competition can make the same features. Your competition can do pretty much everything that you're doing, except they cannot take your customer voice because those customers are unique to you, what they're saying about you. And that's really the last frontier of differentiation is taking your customer voice and letting them tell your story and helping you differentiate in the market. And I think that's super, super important. The next piece I think that we haven't really addressed is knowing more about your buyers and that kind of intelligence piece. And so there's a ton of data sources out there ranging from demographic, firmographic, intent data. There's tons of intent data providers out there. But the more you know about your buyers, where they are in their journey, how they're considering you, what you're being considered based on is really, really important. And so I think a big trend that we have going into 2023 is like really investing in that buyer intelligence, getting as much of the intent signals, being able to decipher those intent signals and then action on them. So if you go back to the earlier question around what not to do, and I was really honing in on the cold calling, buyer intelligence will help you reach out and connect with those buyers on their terms because you know more about them. You know what they're expecting from you. You know where they are in their buyer journey. You know who's maybe on the buying committee. So really invest in those resources to build that buyer intelligence, and that will greatly improve your go-to-market and then reach buyers on their terms and in an authentic way.
So you kind of nailed it, Allison. There's so many different intent providers on the market today. And if you don't have a mature peer review program yet in place, what do you recommend to folks on the call that are just getting started? What would be your ideal kind of crawl, walk, run approach?
So, I mean, first things first is kind of do an analysis of what's out there. I think that two things is what's out there and where are your buyers' eyeballs. Because they're everywhere, and it's difficult, I think, for marketers sometimes, where it's like you want to boil the ocean. Well, find the highest concentration of your target audience, and start there, and then start to think about some of the stuff that we've talked about today about around providing product information up front, making sure that your differentiated stories being told and your customers are at the forefront of your marketing. I think you hear a lot of kind of this customer-led marketing, customer-led growth. And I think that that's going to be a really big, important piece going into this next year. So once you kind of do that analysis, start filling those gaps, making sure that information is readily available, getting your customers on the record. And then I think that would be just step one, right? And then as you start to think about your presence growing on those review platforms, how are you using the content that's on review platforms, not just that it's sitting on a Trust Radius or wherever else? How is it actually working in your marketing and sales efforts? And that's huge, because content can just sit in one place, but any marketer knows one piece of content could be 10, right? So I think that's really important, especially when we need to be super effective with doing more with less. It's like you have all of this amazing content just sitting on one platform. You need to be using that in your own channels. And then the run aspect is when you're actually using the data. So if you with review platforms, it's a really rare second-party data, intent data that you can get, because it's people actually looking at your product, people actually looking at your pricing page, people looking at your competitors. To Simon's point, maybe you're not even in the conversation, maybe you're not making their short list. So I think the run aspect of that is using that data to actually build, again, that kind of buyer intelligence piece.
Yeah, I'll comment on that a little bit too. I was reading through the What's In and What's Out playbook, and one piece of information that stuck out to me was don't be too jargony in your approach, right? Real people tell the best stories. So if you're getting a one-pager or you're getting an email, your eyes are immediately going to skip the marketing jargon and go straight to that real customer quote or that real review, kind of zeroing in on, is this person like me? Was their problem solved? So I think that's a really, really good point, to try to really disseminate that across channels and have it appear as much as possible. And that kind of brings me over to you, Simon. So you recently wrote about how many companies underestimate the rich data that they get out of these reviews and how to leverage this data in their marketing. How can vendors use these review insights to win, especially in this market?
Well, absolutely. And Alison mentioned content. You can't really get a better recommendation than when a customer tells your own story. And having worked in marketing for many years, I know how hard it is to get reference customers for case studies. And so this was always a challenge that we had. But you've got case studies sitting there on Trust Radius that people have written themselves. These are people who are ripe to be persuaded to go down the funnel of being a recommender or an endorser for you. So first of all, it's important to convince your customers to share their experiences. And why are they going to do that? They're going to do that if they can feel that they can help other people, or if they feel that they've done something they're proud of and they achieved and they want to tell the story. So don't just race out there, email your entire marketing database and ask them to write a review, because you get them, but you may not want them. And so also you have to get out of the mindset that it's not just about driving the inventory here. So we talk to vendors all the time, and they're obsessed with how many reviews have we got, how many have they got. And sometimes vendors have got a review program in place, but they're not really quite sure what they're doing with it. So what we help them to do is to act on the data, and to consider it as being near real-time feedback. And it's not the echo chamber you get from a cab or from a focus group with a customer. This is stuff that you're not sitting on their shoulder when they're writing. Well, you're not supposed to be sitting on their shoulder when they're writing their review. And so customers are going to be a little bit more honest than they would with you in the room.
Absolutely agree. And we're not hating on customer advisory boards either. We love their feedback. But yes, Simon, you make a really good point about, just sitting down and being objective. And we only have 1 minute left. So I wanted to present out to the panel here. Do you have any closing thoughts for our folks on the line and what they should really take away from today's session?
I have one, which is that you should think about your reputation. We still see horror stories coming out there in reviews, but these days it's virtually impossible to defend your reputation as a company unless you take a professional approach. And so that's why we think you should invest in taking a professional approach to peer reviews. People are still passing the baton around within the company sometimes about who's responsible for this. Those times should be over. And finally, it's always on these days. There's no point doing a review campaign and then disappearing. Customer doesn't work like that.
Absolutely.
Mine would be, if we have 20 seconds, give me your feedback. We're going to do our 2023 research really soon. What should we be looking at? What are you seeing with your buyers? So let us know, and we'll try and include that in this year's research.
Love the plug. Well, thank you all for being here. There's no time like the present to get started. If you have any questions for us over at Trust Radius, you can go to our website and drop us a line. We are all available as resources to you, everyone on this call. You can ping us on LinkedIn, you can DM us, whatever you need. We look forward to seeing you at our next LinkedIn Live event, and have a great rest of the week.